Humans have found a whole range of uses for birds over the centuries. Hunting with them, keeping them for their song, using them for food or divination, and because some of them are uncommonly pretty. Look at the magnificent peacock with its elaborate tail, or the sweet little goldfinch with its black and red mask. Even the humble dove is both provider of meat and gentle garden presence in its dovecote. In Devon, one tradition actually claimed that the devil could take any form except that of a lamb or a dove. So this time we're going to focus on ornamental birds. So that's basically birds intended for purposes besides consumption. These include pet birds and birds for breeding. So let's explore the folklore of peafowl, partridges, doves and finches in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with our theme of birds, and after having done aquatic birds, birds of prey and garden birds, we're now also having a look at ornamental birds. And we're going to start off with peacocks, which technically it should be peafowl. Obviously peacocks just technically refers to the male, but there we go. We're going to have a look at them anyway. Now they originally come from southern Asia, and villagers would apparently welcome its loud cry because this would warn them of nearby predators. And in these particular regions it was once considered either a magical bird or a forest protector. And in some legends, it was Alexander the Great that introduced the peacock to the Mediterranean, and obviously over time it was then later imported to other areas as well. Now the peacock was sacred to Hera in ancient Greece and then later Juno in Rome, and Ernest Ingersoll notes that the phoenix was often seen as a hybrid of the peacock and the eagle, so it's unsurprising that Hera would take the peacock as her bird when her husband Zeus had the eagle. Now obviously one of the peacock's most striking features is its tail, and a famous myth explains how the peacock ended up with so many eyes in its tail feathers. Now Zeus had been pursuing the nymph Io because Zeus is gonna Zeus, and Hera turned Io into a heifer basically to try and stop Zeus having his wicked way with her, but again, Zeus is gonna Zeus. So convinced that all of this wasn't actually going to stop Zeus in his pursuit of Io, Hera then also set Argus, he of the 100 eyes, to stand guard over Io. Now Zeus obviously wasn't going to let something like that stop him, so he enlisted the help of his son Hermes to do something about Argus. Hermes lured the watchman to sleep, and then once every single one of his 100 eyes was closed, Hermes killed him. Juno was so upset about the death of Argus that she set his 100 eyes in the tail of the peacock in tribute. In some legends you also hear that the peacocks actually pull Hera's chariot as well, which is something that I'd probably quite like to see. But you also have quite a lot of peacock superstitions as well, and these are obviously superstitions that have grown up across a wide range of areas, and in a lot of cases don't really have anything to do with the Greek myth. But it did seem that hearing a peacock cry meant that rain was coming, although if it cried out of time, and I'm not 100% sure what that actually refers to, that was just how it was put across in the book from 1903, but if it did cry out of time, this meant that the bird's owner would die. And indeed, hearing a peacock cry under a window foretold the death of someone inside the house. If you've ever heard a peacock cry as well, they're really distinctive. Despite these particular death omens, having an image of a peacock on the headstone would ensure that the body would be resurrected, since the peacock was linked with immortality. And seeing a peacock when you weren't expecting to see one foretold an accident. Whether this is because you then did something to actually cause yourself to have an accident or not, I'm not really sure. Dreaming of peacocks meant to beware of conceit, and I think part of this is because the peacock is often associated with vanity, and in some cases I think it's because obviously the male is such a showy bird, but it seems a little bit unfair to then label him with human attributes just because he's evolved the way that he has. But that aside, some actresses didn't like using peacock feathers in their costumes because they considered them unlucky, and it was actually unlucky to have peacocks on stage even if that was just their feathers. And even owning peacock feathers could bring misfortune upon yourself. If you were heading to your wedding and you saw a peacock on the way to the venue, it meant that you would be a poor but vain couple. And if a peacock just wandered into your house at random, and I mean, let's be honest, who hasn't had that happen, it meant that a daughter of the family that lived there would marry a spendthrift. That being said, if a woman entered a park and immediately saw a peacock, she would marry a handsome man. It doesn't say what kind of temperament he would have, just that he would be handsome. I'm assuming her definition of handsome, because obviously these things are subjective. But Ingersoll suggests that in Middle Ages fear of illness or death if you brought peacock feathers into the house might actually be a lingering remnant of Juno's ancient cult, because any misfortune might be caused by Juno's anger at your plucking of her bird. And this might also explain why people wouldn't keep peacock feathers in the house if they had daughters, because if they did, no suitors would call. So bear that one in mind. But we're going to move on from one extreme to the other, really, because when you look at male peacocks, obviously peahens tend to be very dowdy, because they have to be, because they need to blend in while they're sitting on the nest, because you don't really want to tell everyone where you're sitting by looking fabulous, but also looking completely out of place at the same time. Partridges, on the other hand, very, very different. And we do have two types of partridge in the British Isles. We've got the grey partridge and the red leg partridge. So the grey one is sometimes called the English partridge and the red leg is sometimes called the French partridge. They are really, really good parents, to the extent that sometimes if a farmer's mowing their fields, a partridge won't actually leave her nest, so she sometimes gets caught up in it, which is sad. And grey partridges were once abundant in the British Isles, but their numbers dropped by 80% after the Second World War. And part of this was due to a combination of herbicides that decimated the insects that the chicks ate and the removal of hedgerows. So if we give birds nothing to eat and nowhere to nest, then we can't exactly be surprised when they disappear. And it's really irritating, because a lot of these birds that do lose their habitat also provide pest control, so it would be quite helpful to actually keep them around. Now, partridges do actually appear in this section because they were kept as game birds, and they did actually arrive in Britain sometime after the Ice Age, so they have been in the British Isles for a really long time. But then Charles II introduced the French partridge into royal parks, which is the red-leg partridge, and apparently both types of partridge were such devoted parents that the partridge was actually a sacred bird of Aphrodite. So which is the famous partridge in a pear tree that you might know from the 12 Days of Christmas? Is it the grey or the red leg? Well, it is potentially the red-leg partridge, since they have sometimes sung from the tops of trees or posts. However, one 1867 theory thought that the pear tree part of the line was actually a misinterpretation of perdix, the Latin word for partridge. So I'm going to assume it wasn't a partridge in a partridge, because that would be a very different type of gift, but who knows what that gift was actually supposed to be. The birds do also turn up in a fairly strange old tradition that you get in rhymes, in which birds then play official roles in ceremonies. So there's the ballad about the death of Cock Robin, which I completely forgot to put in last week's episode, but in that one the cuckoo is the gravedigger, the stork the bell ringer, and the lapwing the clerk. But in this version of the rhyme from the late 19th century from Languedoc, you have ravens are actually ringing the death knell, the cat's carrying the coffin, and the partridge wears mourning. There's not a huge amount of folklore about them, but there are a couple of superstitions. So eating red-legged partridges brought bad luck, and if one flew over your house it would burn down. Obviously the house, that is, not the partridge. And seeing one on a doorstep in the morning foretold a death. These death omens never tell you when the death was going to happen, or indeed whose death was going to happen, because you sort of think, well, everyone's going to die at some point. Like, you know, spoiler alert, but that's going to happen at some point. So do you mean imminently? In which case that makes it a useful omen. Otherwise, if it's just a reminder, then that's just a bit mean. But anyway, a bed that included partridge feathers could prevent disease. So make of that what you will. Now we're going to go from the partridge to the dove. And interestingly, there is actually a little bit of a link there, because where you would potentially want to use partridge feathers in a bed to prevent illness, if you used dove or pigeon feathers, it meant that whoever was lying in the bed couldn't die. As in, not wouldn't, but couldn't die. So obviously you had to be careful if you had anyone who was an invalid or literally dying, that you didn't put them on something like that, because it was just going to prolong their misery. But anyway, the collared dove lives all over northern and western Europe, and has actually basically been making its way further and further north and kind of pushing its territory out, while the turtle dove is migratory and is sadly now only heard in southern and eastern England, where it was once widespread. In folklore, people believed that turtle doves mated for life, which might explain why we see 2 turtle doves in the 12 Days of Christmas. Much like the partridge, the dove was sacred to Aphrodite in ancient Greece, but also Venus in ancient Rome and Inanna for the Sumerians. And in one particular legend, Aphrodite was born from an egg which was rolled ashore by a fish, and this is where she's kind of born out of the sea, and a dove had been brooding the egg, which explains the link. Doves also appear in a couple of specific myths, but in perhaps the most famous one, and this is from ancient Greece, the hunter Orion relentlessly pursued the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione. Now, rather than punish Orion, which would be your obvious bet, Zeus instead turned the girls into doves, and they became the Pleiades constellation to try and evade him. Now, doves also appear in the biblical story in which Noah releases a dove to see if the flood waters have receded, and obviously the bird eventually returns with an olive twig to let Noah know that yes, land has now re-emerged. And the birds also represent the Holy Spirit in Christianity. And Nancy Price notes the use of dove figures on the chain of the font lid in some churches. So as you pull the chain to raise the lid, the figure then descends, thus representing the Holy Spirit's presence during baptism. And obviously I think a lot of people would recognise the dove as a symbol of peace now as well. Now, St Agnes, St David, St Dunstan, St Gregory, St Ernicus and St Remigius are all associated with doves as well. And obviously we've seen this in previous episodes where you do get these links between these birds and saints. And doves sometimes appear in art seemingly whispering into the saint's ear, or in slightly more hardcore versions escaping from the throat of a dead saint to represent their spirit. And in one particular legend, it was actually the dove that perched on the cross during the crucifixion to keep Christ company. So as a result, killing a turtle dove was believed to bring disaster on the culprit, while dreaming of doves was supposed to indicate happiness. And one tradition encouraged people to make a wish 3 times when they heard the first dove of the year, and the wish would thus come true. Yet the link between doves and peace is not universal, and in Japan, doves became messengers of a war god. So in one legend, the hero Yoritomo hid in a hollow tree, and his pursuers passed the tree and 2 doves flew out. So they decided that the hollow must be empty, otherwise the doves would have taken flight a little bit sooner. So obviously they just go straight past the tree, which means Yoritomo can then escape. He later builds shrines to the god of war, whose sacred birds were doves. Now, in Welsh folklore, whenever a dove appeared by Llyn Dylun in Snowdonia, it meant a wicked woman's soul was going down to the underworld. Yet in Irish folklore, the souls of children or sinless people became doves, so it just goes to show how these things do vary. Now, more widely in Wales, doves were apparently connected with disaster omens, especially when they fluttered around collieries, according to Marie Trevelyan, so we do have to be a little bit sceptical about how widespread this actually was. However, as reported in the newspaper, in July 1902, a dove hovered around the mouth of a colliery in Glamorgan, sparking fears among the miners. People had seen doves before the explosion at Llanbradach Colliery and also the Llangennydd and Morfa collieries. And it wasn't just collieries that needed to pay attention. White pigeons were death harbingers, while doves circling a person's head indicated serious illness or death. Elsewhere, if a dove flew into a house where someone was either dead or dying, whoever's feet the dove landed at would be the next to die, and if a dove cooed in a doorway, it meant death was coming. However, in Scotland, seeing a black dove followed by a white dove meant joy would follow bad luck, while in Lancashire, seeing a white dove at a sick room window either meant the person would recover, or an angel had arrived to collect the soul. It was a good omen for doves to fly over freshly dug graves because it would take the soul to heaven, and if it flew over the dead or landed on the coffin, it also meant that the dead was at peace. Another superstition recommended that if you actually sat a live dove at the head of a coffin and then let it go, you could check the direction to see whether the soul had actually gone to heaven or not, and indeed it had to fly south to indicate this. Apparently if it flew south, it also meant that the deceased was in love, and I'm not quite sure why that would be relevant, but there we go. So doves in particular have a little bit of a contradictory side as far as we can see there. Now we're going to finish off with finches, and you might wonder why I've included them in the ornamental birds theme, and sadly until the late 19th century people did capture goldfinches, chaffinches and bullfinches and then keep them in cages as songbirds. Chaffinches in particular were known for their bright singing voice, and boys in northern England and Scotland imitated its call as weet weet dreep dreep, which was believed to herald rain. Elsewhere in Scotland, however, people called it the drunken sow because they heard drink drink till you fow wee drunken sowie in its song. This is going to be amazing seeing some of these on the subtitles, mind. People in Germany also kept the crossbill, which is a type of finch, but not as a songbird, and this was why I wanted to include this one, because they actually believed that just having the bird around could remove colds and rheumatism, and if you drank the water out of its drinking bowl, this would treat epilepsy. And if that wasn't enough, people also thought that crossbills could prevent houses from being struck by lightning or burning down. And finally, they thought that they would also wake children if children were sleeping in moonlight, because that was believed to be unhealthy for them. Now, for the goldfinch, people in Suffolk called it King Harry Redcap for its fancy plumage, reminiscent of Henry VIII's robes. And its Old English name was Thistletoeger or Thistletoeker. I've no idea if that pronunciation is correct, because it is Old English, but there we go. But its name was meant to mean Thistletoeker because it enjoyed eating thistle seeds. Over the years, people have also called it Goldspink, Speckled Dick, which is a fabulous name, Sweet William, Sheriff's Man, and the Lady with 12 Flounces, which just seems excessive as a name. It did make me wonder if that's where Goldspink Road next to Jesmond Old Cemetery got its name from, if perhaps there were once a colony of goldfinches in the area, but I wasn't really able to dig into that any further. So if anybody is aware of whether that's where it got its name from, please do feel free to let me know. And finally, I just wanted to include this one because it's so cute, but the collective noun for a group of goldfinches is a charm. So obviously collective nouns are things like a murder of crows, a parliament of owls. So yes, you get a charm of goldfinches, which I just think is lovely. So I always do a what do we make of these kind of birds, and I think these particular birds, their folklore is actually quite straightforward in that peacocks become associated with vanity, and therefore you don't really want to have any reminders of them in the house in case that might attract particular types of suitors, or indeed no suitors at all, depending on the folklore. And I think that's where the fact they get associated with Hera, while on one hand that makes sense through this idea of the phoenix being like a combination of the peacock and the eagle, Hera's always kind of portrayed as being quite vain, and I think that's really unfair, and I do think that she has been dealt quite a rubbish blow. And the same happens with Juno as well, which you might remember from the Juno episode, in that both figures are really portrayed quite negatively compared to the philandering behaviour of their spouses, which I think you can read a fair amount into. As for the other birds, the fact that you have them as either holy companions like the dove, but then also a death omen in Wales, I do think that this may just speak perhaps to how common particular types of behaviour might be, how common the birds themselves might have been as well, and just how people actually relate to them. And I think that these particular birds, the partridges obviously don't really have a huge amount of folklore associated with them, and neither do the finches, but the fact that they have some indicates that people did at least think something of them to actually preserve some of that lore as superstitions and so on. But I just thought they were quite interesting, and just that sheer range of names for the goldfinch I think made it worthy of inclusion. Next week we are going to finish off this birds theme, and we are going to be having a look at mythical birds. So the obvious one is the phoenix, but I do also want to include the martlet as well, which is one that's perhaps maybe not necessarily as famous. And if I can dig up any tales of specific mythical birds, as in like named individuals, not just types of mythical birds, then obviously I will include that as well. And then for September, I'm going to let you know now, we're going to be having a look at the folklore of islands. So that's basically going to be obviously folklore associated with specific named islands, not just islands in general. So that one should certainly be fun. And also you'll hopefully have seen that another episode went live of Fabulous Folklore Presents. So you got 2 this month, mostly because of my scheduling. I forgot what I'd put in when, so I thought let's just have 2 episodes of it. Because why not? So obviously there's the one with Teresa Matsura earlier in the month, and then this time you've got James Wright debunking some myths about historic buildings. So I hope that you enjoyed that one as well if you haven't already seen it on the feed. Other than that, it's been marvellous chatting to you, and I will see you next week when we have a look at some mythical birds. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.